I'm Cully Cobb. I'm a longtime friend and associate of Dr. William Meacham, who is the retired professor of neurosurgery at Vanderbilt, and for many years the head of the division of neurosurgery at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm talking with Dr. Meacham this afternoon, a rainy November afternoon in Nashville, to learn a little bit about his background, his interests, and his ideas about the present and the future for his specialty of neurosurgery. This is a subject that has occupied most of his lifetime, and I think he'll have some interesting things to tell us about this. First, it might be worthwhile to learn a little bit about the early background of Dr. Meacham. He was born in Washington, D.C., and lived there a short time before moving to Western Kentucky, where his family had come from. His roots are very strong in Western Kentucky, so a lot of people are surprised to find that he actually originated far from that rural area. Tell us a little bit about what you do recall of those early years, Bill.
Well, I was born, as you said, in Washington because my father was stationed there in the Marines, but we moved back to Hopkinsville, Kentucky when I was 10 years old. And my father died then, and my mother had previously died when I was 3 years old, so I was reared by my grandmother. And for the most part, I was kind of a hellraiser, I think, in my youth. I kept getting kicked out of school and refusing to take final examinations, and I would take hobo trips and hitchhiking trips, and if it hadn't been for the patience of my grandmother, I think I'd have ended up in the penitentiary. But I did a lot of different things. I worked on the railroad one summer and worked in a rock quarry in St. Louis one summer, and I was interested in aviation, and another close friend of mine and I decided we'd be stunt men, and he actually made a lot of free fall parachute jumps. All I did was hang on the wings of the biplane, which was just as safe as being in the cockpit, so it was not due to any courageousness on my part. I got sick one year, and they thought I had tuberculosis, and I had to lay on my back in the bed and look at the ceiling for about 11 or 12 months, and I decided then I'd do something different. And I decided to go to college, and I did by virtue of blowing the saxophone, the clarinet, and a dance band, and paid my way for the most part through college in the first year of medical school, playing in a dance band. I got interested in studying medicine the year I was sick. I thought probably that I might amount to something, and it changed the idea of my grandmother and my uncles, who was all certain that I was going to end up in the Kentucky State Penitentiary. So that's a little bit about my background.
I've seen that penitentiary at Eddyville, and I think one good look at that might be enough to convince you either to go into the dance band business or maybe into the medical field, as you did.
I visited the Eddyville Penitentiary once and had the privilege of sitting in the electric chair. Our Boy Scout troop went.
I've never been that close to it. but it's an impressive, great stone castle of a building on the banks of the Cumberland River, and a very foreboding sight indeed for the passerby. How did you get into the saxophone playing? Did you have a lot of formal instruction in that?
I never had a lesson. I caddied at a golf course one summer in high school and saved $35 and bought a second-hand saxophone and learned to play just kind of by catch as catch can. Got interested in jazz, and actually booked our college band and played alto sax in it for all the years I was in college. So that's how that happened. And then in recent years, we've had a doctor's dance band here in Nashville that was composed of all doctors who used to play, and we've had a good time doing that, but it finally broke up.
That Doctor's Dance Band was popular in this town in Nashville for many years, and Dr. Meacham is very well known for his participation in the Doctor's Dance Band. They would actually play big band type music primarily, to my ear, for parties and all types of activities. And I think all the people in there formed quite a little nucleus of friends with an interest largely in, I guess, big band or jazz type music.
That's right.
Is that
no rock and roll.
Almost pre-rock and roll. But at any rate, I know that has been a subject of a great deal of interest. Tell us a little bit about your days at Western Kentucky.
Well, I went to Western Kentucky because they needed an alto sax player in the dance band. And that was how I was able to choose a college. But I came under the influence while there of a very dedicated, conscientious teacher, Dr. Lancaster, who was head of the biology division. And he motivated me, I think, to really study and try to attain some expertise in the biological mechanisms. He was a wonderful teacher. He's now dead. But we have established a Lancaster lectureship at Western Kentucky. And each year, some individual gives the Lancaster lecture. I might add that I was invited to give the first one, which I was glad to do several years ago. He and Dr. McNally, who was head of the chemistry department, were my prime motivators, I think, in trying to establish some record of grades good enough to go to medical school, because I had decided then I wanted to go to medical school and become an obstetrician. And I must say that after I graduated from medical school, my ideas of being an obstetrician had completely changed. After delivering a few babies in the homes, as we did as junior students, I found out that I wasn't doing anything that required any expertise, because these multiparous ladies all knew more about it than I did. So I went into surgery as a greater challenge.
Dr. Lancaster was very well known around Vanderbilt for recommending graduates of his university who would do well in medical school. I've talked to Dr. Sam Clark, who was for many years the editor of Ranson and Clark Neuroanatomy text, and who had to do with the admissions committee at one time, also Dr. Jim Ward in the same role. And they would almost invariably accept any student recommended by Dr. Lancaster. In fact, Dr. Clark had a few personal contacts like Dr. Lancaster in other lesser known universities throughout the South, from which he always felt that he got his very best students for the Vanderbilt Medical School. And Dr. Meacham was one of those. I think you said Beverly Tower and Bob Shell were friends of yours, all of whom came with you at the same time from
We were classmates
Western
at Western and also through 4 years of medical school.
Dr. Clark told me one time that he would much prefer a person from Western Kentucky, at one time State College, now University, recommended by Dr. Lancaster, over some person with average grades who came with recommendations from Harvard or Yale or Princeton or one of the other northern schools. And that surprised me when I first came to Vanderbilt, because you wouldn't offhand think that the smaller universities would be so prominent among the ultimate graduates of Vanderbilt. And during your years at Western Kentucky, you did some outside working too, you told me. Playing the saxophone,
yeah, we
working
traveled
on the railroad.
I laid out of school part of one year, and we had a dance band at Lynchburg, Virginia. And we played the college circuit there, but I've often told the tale that I left home with $19 and came back 5 months later with $9. So my career in the traveling dance band business ended up with a $10 deficit. But one summer I worked as an orderly in the operating room at Barnes Hospital, Washington University in St. Louis. And there I got to see some great surgeons at work, Dr. Everett Graham and Dr. Ernest Sachs and Dr. Vilry Blair, and it really motivated and stimulated me to go on into surgery.
Did you think, or do you now think that your contact with Dr. Sachs, I suppose that was your first neurosurgery contact, wasn't it?
It was, yes. I watched him operate, and I admired his operating ability, but he was a tough, vindictive person, and I was glad that I wasn't working for him, although we later became very close, good friends. And his son, Ernest Sachs, Jr., was one of our interns when I was resident.
I met Dr. Sachs not that early, but his son Ernie was a classmate of mine in medical school at Harvard. And so I knew Ernie very well long before I got interested in neurosurgery, and of course before I met Dr. Sachs, who was, I suppose, he was aging by the time by the time I got to know him. And anyways, that's an interesting sort of thing. Any other particular thoughts about undergraduate education?
Not particularly. I was concerned when I first came to Vanderbilt as to whether or not I was appropriate in wanting to be an obstetrician. I don't know what motivated me to want to do that, but it didn't take me long to change, because I soon came under the influence of some teachers in surgery that made me realize that surgery was the field that I wanted to go into. And namely, these were Dr. Barney Brooks primarily, and later Dr. Ernest, Dr. Eugene Regan, and Dr. Cobb Pilcher, of course. Now, these 2 or 3 men had a great influence on my desire to go into surgery. And these were war years, and I was turned down for going into the Army because I'd had a history of having had a year's bed rest for presumably tuberculosis. So I had to stay at Vanderbilt and was not in the military. And Dr. Brooks, during that period of time, was my surgical chief, and he influenced me enough that I wanted to stay in surgery. And I stayed and went through a 5-year general surgical residency under Dr. Brooks, who was a very stern and demanding taskmaster, but was a very lovable person outside the hospital, an impeccable host. I would have to say that after having rotated, as all the residents and interns did, through neurological surgery under Dr. Cobb Pilcher, my interest in general surgery waned a little bit, and I decided that neurosurgery was really the most challenging pioneer field that existed at that time. And Dr. Pilcher motivated me to want to go on into neurological surgery. So after finishing 5 years of general surgery training, I practiced general surgery in the university for 6 or 8 months until the war came close to being over. And then I went into neurosurgery for a 3-year additional residency period under Dr. Pilcher. Now, he was an impeccable surgeon, a very high-strung, tense individual who was a wonderful surgical, technical person. He would sometimes lose his temper, as you know, in the operating room, but was a kind and generous person. Now, he influenced me a great deal. I saw him doing operations in the 40s that no one else would attempt. He was doing intracranial aneurysms without the advent of arterial x-rays, because they weren't known at that time. and he did many of them successfully. He was doing almost inoperable brain tumors on people that other people would not attempt. So he was a very courageous individual, and unfortunately his career had to terminate by his death after only a 10-year period of really professional activity. Now, he and Dr. Brooks, I think, were the prime motivators for me in terms of going into surgery and then neurosurgery.
These were two of the most popular teachers who ever were at Vanderbilt. Dr. Brooks was the type of autocratic professor who frightened the medical students, and he almost made a game of teaching by scaring the younger medical students. I met him after coming to Vanderbilt, and found him an extremely likable, but as Bill says, a somewhat domineering individual. He was a very small man. I think I said he came from Barnes, from St. Louis, to Vanderbilt, and he was the first modern professor of surgery at Vanderbilt. Dr. Pilcher, Dr. Cobb Pilcher, had been a pupil of Harvey Cushing's, and he was a full-fledged member of what some people call the second generation of neurosurgeons. And for both Bill and for me, I think he was a big stimulus that led us into this field. I've talked with him a little bit about his experiences in Boston and his knowing Dr. Cushing. Dr. Pilcher himself was a very charismatic individual, a person who attracted very strong allegiances, and you're looking at a couple of his real disciples. Because of his short career, there are many people who don't know about Dr. Pilcher, but I think that at the time he was one of the most rapidly rising students of Harvey Cushing. At any rate, after you found out you didn't want to be an obstetrician after all, which is probably the world's loss in those terms, you were taken up very much by the general surgery group, and you were the full resident in general surgery for some little time, and pretty much Dr. Brooks's white-haired boy at that stage, were you not?
Well, I don't know whether I was a white-haired boy or not, but I was having to assume a lot of duties because the staff was rather depleted due to the military demands on the staff.
How did he feel when you gave him the word that you thought you just might change over to neuro?
Well, he said he was disappointed, but encouraged me in it. So that sounds like a paradox, but he talked to Dr. Pilcher and encouraged me to go ahead in what I wanted to do. Dr. Brooks was never, in my opinion, against anything I wanted to do, except he felt that I should not join some surgical organizations that had a dubious character behind them, and I always remembered that, and I've never joined any of them. I did go ahead and take the general surgical board exams and was certified in general surgery, and then later was certified in neurosurgery on the basis of what Dr. Pilcher recommended, and Dr. Brooks too. So I think if he was mildly disappointed that I left general surgery, it was no real hardship to him. It was hard for me to do because by that time I had gotten married and we had one child, and to go back into a training program was a little bit harder on my wife than it was on me. But we both survived it all right.
Dr. Meacham's wife, Alice, was a scrub nurse at Vanderbilt at the time they met.
For Dr. Pilcher.
For
it was his
not Dr.
nurse.
Brooks, but for Dr. Pilcher.
That's right.
But you were not married until after you finished.
No, it's rather
residency.
Humorous. When I was an intern Alice and I asked Dr. Brooks if we could get married. Well, I was in his office about 5 minutes. Alice had the interview following me. She was in there about 45 minutes and came out saying that Dr. Brooks said if we got married, one thing was certain to happen, that he would fire me. But he also told her why. He said, if you get married on my service, you'll have to neglect one of two things. You'll either neglect your wife or you'll neglect my service. And he said, since I don't want my service neglected, I'd have to fire him. So we got married when I finished my surgical residency. And Dr. Brooks was very gracious, gave us some lovely presents as a wedding present. But he would not let anybody on his house staff get married until the war depleted the staff, and then he did take on some married people.
Even Dr. Brooks had to change his ways a little bit with the
That's right. He finally
pressures
did.
of modern social reform, right?
That's correct.
I think those are the main questions I had to ask you about medical school and the early training. Tell us a little bit about your life as a neurosurgeon, or the points of special interest, or particularly how things have changed over the period of your interest in neurosurgery. You are what I suppose they would call a third generation. That is, a person taught directly by a pupil of someone like Cushing or Dandy.
I think you and I both are third generation neurosurgeons, and now we're the older group that is now extant.
We're not too keen about some aspects.
That's right.
Of that.
Well, when I finished training, Dr. Pilcher suggested that maybe it would be a good idea for me to spend some time in Montreal at the Montreal Neurological Institute at McGill under Dr. Penfield, and I was glad to go. I was there a few months and studied only neuropathology. Dr. Penfield was an entirely different kind of person. He was a pure intellectual surgeon. Everything that he did, whether he was examining a patient or doing an operation or anything else, was always on the basis of an experiment to see what would happen if. And I was influenced by this. He was a very kind and gracious individual. And when I came back from Montreal after that, Dr. Pilcher wanted me to use the Penfield stain for some of our tumors and other things, so it wasn't time wasted, and I think I benefited from that. Dr. Pilcher was so busy that he finally got into a mechanism, I guess, physical fatigue, and he decided to take a trip to Europe and went along with a close friend of his, Dr. Ed Fincher from Emory University. And when he came back from his European trip, he looked to me refreshed and anxious to go, and as I've often said, we sat down one day in the lab and talked about some preliminary experiments we were going to be doing and research and other things, and 2 or 3 days later he was dead, suddenly and unannounced. That put you and me, as well as any of the other house staff, in a terrible position, because there was this tremendously busy neurosurgical service at Vanderbilt and no chief. And I think you remember, Cully, that Dr. Brooks didn't want to appoint anybody on a full-time basis because of his imminent retirement. And he knew that he was going to be replaced in 2 or 3 years or so. And I think he asked you and me individually to see that the service was kept up and to run it, which we both did. But when Dr. William Scott came as chief, he decided to appoint me as chief, and we've worked together ever since. Now, I think the greatest benefit that I've gotten from academic neurosurgery has been the training of residents that you and others have had a great part in. We've worked together all these many years, and I suppose we've never had a conflict. I think the people that we've trained have all turned in a very commendable job in terms of the academic aspects of it, as well as the clinical success of their work. And we now have, I suppose, 45 or 50 people over the country that have trained under our auspices and of whom we have reason to be proud. Now, I think the thing that I neglected the most on a personal basis was the continuation of the basic research in the laboratory at Vanderbilt because of the demands on the time of the heavy clinical service. That doesn't mean we didn't write papers or contribute chapters in books, but in actually going to the lab, the last 10 years or so of my tenure, we had very little basic laboratory research going on, to my regret, because we had previously done a great deal of that under Dr. Pilcher's aegis, as you know. I think these are the things that I've had the most benefit from. I'm glad that I was able to be associated in an academic institution in my career. It's been a real joy to have had the career that you and I have both experienced, because we've seen the best of medicine and the best of surgery, and what the future holds is probably going to be even greater, but I can't predict that it'll be so.
The subject of the relationship to the house staff is something that has always meant a great deal to me, and especially also to Dr. Meacham. This little book is one of the annual volumes about the Meacham Neurosurgical Society. We have a very close-knit group of ex-residents. They know each other, they get to know one another over the years, and they come back, and they always like to relive some of their experiences on the house staff, and they have a very, very strong feeling of affection for Dr. Meacham. Both of us feel, I guess all teachers of a field, a specialty subject like neurosurgery, that we're almost closer to this group of individuals than anybody else except for our own children, as far as the next generation of people is concerned. A lot of things have happened over the years that you and I have been in neurosurgery. I was thinking a little while ago that some things have come and gone, like sympathectomy for hypertension. I always thought that was a pretty good operation, and you did.
That's right.
Probably several hundred of those, didn't you?
I did so many, it was hard for the residents to want to scrub on them anymore because it got to be so routine now. It's never done anymore. Well, and we were at the very beginning of the stereotactic part of neurosurgery too. When we first started doing carotid artery occlusions for the control of involuntary resting tremor, Parkinson's disease, and later the injection of sclerosing substances in the globus pallidum, and then later the true stereotactic methods of thalamotomy and pallidotomy. And I suppose they're almost gone, although in the current journal there's an article that is lauding the effectiveness of the small lesion in the thalamus now for Parkinson's disease.
I think those simple stereotactic procedures we were doing were actually more prophetic than we knew at the time, because right now there is an increasing emphasis on stereotactic surgery.
That's correct.
And such thing as CT-guided stereotactic procedures. Of course, in those earlier days, we had only X-rays and not the CT scan for that more accurate type of guidance. The vascular field has always been a favorite of yours.
Yes, I think we were early on in the interest in doing intracranial aneurysms because of Dr. Pilcher. And you've continued that, and I have. And I think for a long time we were doing intracranial aneurysms directly where many institutions weren't, or many neurosurgeons would not do them. So we usually would do a good many aneurysm cases each year. Now I think it's gradually becoming a problem where you don't approach the aneurysm, and you may do it with a balloon occlusion or other types of things. But I think we were in on the ground floor on the vascular surgery.
And of course, I remember when I first came here, Dr. Pilcher's interest in the AV malformation.
That's right.
And you continue with that, and all the rest of us, for that matter.
That's correct. Well, I think we've been fortunate in seeing we weren't pioneers, but we were second or third generation of the pioneers, and we've seen all of the modern aspects of clinical neurosurgery come. Some have gone, but some have stayed, and I think our technique has been proven to be worthwhile.
You've been president of nearly every major neurosurgical organization, and also prominently active in the American College of Surgeons, haven't you?
Yes, I was on the board of governors of the American College and was on the board of regents for 9 years, and I served 6 years on the American Board of Neurological Surgery, and I have been president of a good many organizations, but I have never run for office, and I don't intend to. I think you've been very gracious, Dr. Cobb, to interview me for historical sake, and I thank you very much.
You want to say another word or two about the future? We have a new situation now. There were relatively few neurosurgeons in the world, or in the United States, when you and I were entering this field. There are many, many more at the present time. What do you think the future does hold in our field?
I've been a little worried about the future of neurological surgery because I think tumors are sooner or later going to be controlled by non-operative means, very likely, except maybe for the meningioma or whatnot. I'm afraid that direct vascular operations intracranially are probably going to be substituted for, and maybe better, by balloon occlusions and other methods of treatment. So that I think there's always going to be the need for a neurosurgeon for trauma. There's going to be maybe the need for neurosurgery for other things, such as the involuntary resting tremor. But pain is no longer really a neurosurgical problem as it was in our day when we did cordotomies and things of that sort for the control of pain, because it's a chemical therapeutic method now. So I think maybe our specialty is going to be more narrow, but I think there'll always be a need for neurological surgeons. And I think that's gracious, because without one, I think we'd be in bad shape.
One of Dr. Meacham's children went to medical school and is now a member of the surgical staff at Vanderbilt, but he's doing primary vascular surgery.
Yes, he says neurosurgery is not interesting, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not speaking to him. I said that in jest, but he is a good vascular surgeon, but he's doing a lot of the things that we used to do, the carotid endarterectomies and things of that sort.
I think that's neat that the child of a prominent neurosurgeon who himself has done lots and lots of endarterectomies now probably is doing more of those at Vanderbilt. This is Pat Meacham, a wonderful young man and perfectly delightful member of our staff. And I think he's having a lot of fun at that work.
Well, he is. He's enjoying his work, and he's doing a good work as far as I know. I might intrude upon your personal life to say that your son, Dr. Terry Cobb, is a fine, accomplished, and distinguished neurosurgeon in Sacramento, California, and I know you're proud of him.
I am. In fact, I hope to go skiing with him at Christmas time. Do you want to say
I'll have to take call for you.
a word or two about your other children?
Well, my daughter Barbara is a landscape architect and lives in San Francisco. My youngest son, Bob, is currently a representative of a munitions company, and he sells munitions in Central and South America to friendly governments, so it's with the approval of our government. And my oldest son, Bill, is an archaeologist and lives in Hong Kong. He's been in Hong Kong now 17 years, and we see him every 3 or 4 years.
Your children couldn't be more totally diversified in their interests, but they're all up to something, all deeply involved in something.
Well, they are, that's true.
Shows there's nothing to heredity, doesn't it?
The most important thing that they should be doing, and they're not. They're not supporting their daddy.
Well, it's been nice to do this little interview. We've talked to each other for many, many years about all kinds of things, but I think we never did a formal interview
That's
before.
right. Cully, I want to thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, all right.